Joshua, the theory Mallory for publishing, edition June 2020. Digital Hall Codes, no copyrights, is written for educational purposes only. Encourages live chat, comments, etc. Continuing on page 176. That's the showroom. That's the theater phase. pre-pandemic era, the buzz of digital transformation was the mantra of most boards and executive committees. Digital was key. Digital was key. Excuse me while I burst the Bluetooth flames. Sorry. It's not in the script. It had so in the pre 2.1.1 page 176, acceleration of digitization in the pre-pandemic era, the buzz of digital digital transformation was the mantra of most boards and executive committees. Digital was key. It had to be resolutely implemented and was seen as a precondition to success. Since then, in the space of just a few months, the mantra has become a must. Even in the case of some companies, a question of life or death. This is explicable and understandable. During confinement, we depended entirely on the net for most things, from work and education to socialization. It is the online services that allowed us to keep a semblance of normalcy. It is only natural that the online should be the largest beneficiary of the pandemic, giving a tremendous boost to technologies and processes that enable us to do things remotely. Universal broadband internet, mobile and remote payments, and workable e-government services, among others. And as a direct consequence, businesses that were already operating online are bound to benefit from a competitive advantage. As more and diverse things and services are brought to us via our mobiles and computers, companies and sectors, and disparate as e-commerce, contactless operations, digital content, robots, and drone deliveries, to name just a few, will thrive. It is not by accident that firms like Alibaba, Amazon, Netflix, or Zoom emerged as winners from the lockdowns. By and large, the consumer sector moved first and fastest from the necessary contactless experience imposed upon many food and retail companies. During the lockdowns to the virtual showrooms and manufacturing industry allow clients to browse and choose the products they like best. Most business to consumer companies rapidly understood the need to offer their clients a beginning to end digital journey. As some lockdowns came to an end and certain economies crept back to life, similar opportunities emerged in business applications, particularly in manufacturing, where physical distancing rules had to be put into place as short noticed, often in challenging environments, for example, on assembly lines. As a direct result, the information of things, or IoT, made impressive inroads. Some companies that had been shown in the recent pre-lockdown past to adopt IoT are now embracing it en masse with the specific objective of doing as many things as possible remotely. Equipment maintenance of these different activities can now be performed to a large extent via computer. IoT offers companies information of things, Internet of Things, IoT, offers companies not only the means to execute and uphold social distancing rules, but also to reduce costs and implement more agile operations. During the peak of the pandemic, 020, is that 0202? Looks cool. Oh, online to offline, 020, online to offline, gained major traction, highlighting the importance of having both an online and offline presence, and opening the door for perhaps even the floodgates to aversion, aversion, aversion. This phenomenon of blurring the distinction between online and offline, as identified by the famous science fiction writer William Gibson, who stated, "Our world is ever-ending." Source number 130. With the Our world is ever-ending, with the cyberspace relentlessly opening out, has emerged as one of the most potent trends of the COVID-19 era. The pandemic crisis accelerated this phenomenon of aversion because it forced and encouraged because it both forced and encouraged us towards a digital weightless world faster than ever. It has more and more economic activity had no choice but to take place digitally. Education, consulting, publishing, and many others would go as far to say that for a little while, teleportation supplanted transportation. Most executive committee meetings, board meetings, team meetings, brainstorm exercises, and other forms of personal or social interaction had to take place remotely. This new reality is captured in the market capitalization of Zoom, the video conferencing company that skyrocketed to 70 billion in June 2020, higher at that time than that of any US airline. Concurrently, large online companies like Amazon and Alibaba expanded decisively in the O2O business, or online to offline business, particularly in food, retailing, and logistics. Trends like telemedicine or remote working that expanded extensively during the confinement are unlikely to retreat. For them, there will be no return to the status quo that prevailed prior to the pandemic. Telemedicine, in particular, will benefit considerably. For obvious reasons, healthcare is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world, a fact that inevitably slows the pace of innovation. But the necessity to address the pandemic with any means available plus during the outbreak, they need to protect health workers by allowing them to work remotely, remove some of the regulatory and legislative impediments related to the adoption of telemedicine. In the future, it is certain that more medical care will be delivered remotely. It will, in turn accelerate the trends towards more wearable and at-home diagnostics, like smart toilets capable of tracking health data and performing health analyses. Equally, the pandemic may prove to be a boon for online education. In Asia, the shift to online education has been particularly notable, with a sharp increase in students' digital enrollments, much higher valuation for online education businesses, and more capital available for ed tech or education tech startups and tech startups. The flip side of this particular coin will be an increase in pressure on institutions offering more traditional methods of education to validate their worth and justify their fees, as we expand upon a little later. The speed of expansion has been nothing short of breathtaking. In Britain, less than 1% of Britain, less than 1% of initial medical consultations took place via video link in 2019. Under lockdown, 100% are occurring remotely. In another example, a leading US retailer in 2019 wanted to launch a curbside delivery business. Its plan envisaged taking 18 months. During the lockdown, it went live in less than a week, allowing it to serve its customers while maintaining the livelihoods of its workforce. Online banking interactions have risen to 90% during the crisis, from 10% with no drop off in quality and an increase in compliance, while providing a customer experience that isn't just about online banking. Source number 131. Similar examples abound. The social mitigation response to the pandemic and the physical distancing measures imposed during the confinement will also result in e-commerce emerging as an ever more powerful had never online shopped will become comfortable with doing so, while people who were part-time online shoppers will presumably rely on it more. This was made evident during the lockdowns. In the US, Amazon and Walmart hired a combined 250,000 workers to keep up with the increase in demand and built massive infrastructure to deliver online. This accelerating growth of e-commerce means that the giants of the online retail industry are likely to emerge from the crisis even stronger than they were in the pre-pandemic era. There are always two sides to a story. As the habit of a shopping as the habit of shopping online becomes more prevalent, it will depress bricks and mortar high street and mall retail still further, a phenomenon explored in more detail in the next sections. 2.1.2. Resilient supply chains. The very nature of global supply chains and their innate fragility means that arguments about shortening them have been brewing for years. They trend to be intricate and complex to manage. They are also difficult to monitor in terms of compliance with environmental standards and labor laws, potentially exposing companies to reputation risk and damage to their brands. In light of this troubled past, the pandemic has placed the last nail in the coffin of the principle that companies should optimize supply chains based on individual component costs and, depending on a single supply source for critical materials, summed up as favoring efficiency over resilience. In the post pandemic era, in its end to end value optimization, an idea that includes both resilience and efficiency alongside cost that will prevail. It is epitomized in the formula that just in case will eventually replace just in time. The shocks to global supply chains analyzed in the macro section will affect global businesses and smaller companies alike. But what does just in case mean in practice? The model of globalization developed at the end of the last century, convinced and conceived and constructed by global manufacturing companies that were on the prowl for cheap labor products and components, has found its limits. Its fragmented international production into ever more intricate bits and pieces and resulted run run on a just-in-time basis that has proven to be extremely lean and efficient, but also exceedingly complex and has such very vulnerable complexity brings fragility and often results in instability. Simplification is therefore the antidote, which should in turn generate more resilience. This means that the global value chains that represent roughly three quarters of all global trade will inevitably decline. This decline will also be compounded by the new reality that companies depend upon complex, just in time supply chains can no longer take it for granted that tariff commitments enshrined by the World Trade Organization will protect them from a sudden surge in protectionism somewhere. As a result, they will be forced to prepare accordingly by reducing or localizing their supply chain and elaborating alternative production or procurement plans to guard against a prolonged disruption. Every business whose profitability is contingent upon the principle of just-in-time global supply chain will have to rethink how it operates and probably sacrifice the idea of maximizing efficiency and profits for the sake of supply security. And resilience. Resilience will therefore become the primary consideration for any business serious about hedging against disruption, be it disruption to a particular supplier, to a possible change in trade policy, or to a particular country or region. In practice, this will force companies to diversify their supplier base, even at the cost of holding inventories and building in redundancy. It will also compel those companies to ensure that the same is true within their own supply chain. They will assess resilience along their entire supply chain, all the way down to their ultimate supplier, and possibly even the suppliers of their suppliers. The cost of production will inevitably rise, but this will be the price to pay for building resilience. At first glance, the industries that will be the most affected because they will be the first to shift production patterns are automotive, electronics, and industrial machinery. Two dot three dot government and biz. For all the reasons expanded upon in the first chapter, COVID 19 has rewritten many of the rules of the game between the public and private sectors. 2.1.3. Government and business. For all the reasons expanded upon in the first chapter, COVID-19 has rewritten many of the rules of the game between public and private sectors. In the post-pandemic era, business will be subject to much greater government interference than in the past. The benevolent or otherwise greater intrusion of governments in the life of companies and the conduct of their business will be country and industry dependent, and different guises outlined below are three notable forms. Outlined below are three notable forms of impact that will emerge as with the force in the early months of the post-pandemic period: conditional bailouts, public procurement, and labor market regulations. For a start, all the stimulus packages being put together in Western economies to support ailing industries and individual companies will have covenants constraining, in particular, the borrower's ability to fire employees, buy back shares, and pay executive bonuses. In the same vein, governments encouraged, supported, and sometimes pushed by activists in public sentiments will target suspiciously low corporate tax bills and generously high executive rewards. They will show little patience for senior executives and investors who push companies to spend more on buybacks, minimize their tax payments, and pay huge dividends. U.S. Airlines pilloried for seeking government assistance, having recently and consistently used large amounts of company and cash to pay shareholder dividends, are a prime example of how this change in public attitude will be enacted by governments. In addition to the coming months and years, a regime change might occur when policymakers take on a substantial portion of private sector default risk. When this happens, governments will want something in return. Germany's bailout of Lufthansa epitomizes this sort of situation. The the government injected liquidity into the national carrier, but only the condition that the company constrains executive pay, including stock options, and commits to not paying dividends. 2024, better alignment between public policy and corporate planning will be a particular focus of attention in terms of greater government interference. Interference. The scramble for ventilators during the peak of the pandemic epitomizes why in 2010 in the US 40,000 ventilators had been ordered through a government contract, but were never delivered. The scramble for ventilators during the peak of the pandemic epitomizes why in 2010 in the US 40,000 ventilators had been ordered through a government contract but were never delivered, largely explaining the country's shortage that became so apparent in March 2020. What led to this situation of scarcity? In 2012, the original company that had won the bid was born in somewhat dubious and obscure circumstances by a much larger manufacturer, a publicly traded company also producing ventilators. And it later emerged that the purchasing company wanted to prevent the original bidder from building the cheaper ventilator that would have undermined the profitability of its own business. These are life saving tools. This company dragged its feet before eventually canceling the contract and ultimately being acquired by a rival. None of the 40,000 ventilators that were ever delivered to the U.S. government, source number 132, it is likely that this sort of situation will recur in the post-pandemic era, as public authorities will think twice about outsourcing projects that have critical public health implications, or indeed critical public implications, security or otherwise, to private companies. The bottom line, the maximization of profit and the short-termism that often goes with it is rarely, or at least not always, consistent with the public goal of preparing for a future crisis. Around the world, the pressure to improve the social protection of salary level of low-paid employees will increase. Most likely in our post-pandemic world, increases in the minimum wage will become a central issue that will be addressed via the greater regulation of minimum standards and a more thorough enforcement of the rules that already exist. Most probably, companies will have to pay higher taxes and various forms of government funding, like services for social care, the gig economy, will feel the impact of social policy more than any other sector. Prior to the pandemic, it was already in the crosshairs of government scrutiny. In the post-pandemic era, for reasons related to the redefinition of the social contract, this scrutiny will intensify. Companies that rely on gig workers to operate will also feel the effect of more government interference, possibly even to a degree capable of undermining their financial viability, as the pandemic will radically alter social and political attitudes towards gig workers. Governments will force those companies that employ them to offer proper contracts with benefits such as social insurance and health coverage. The labor issue will loom large for them, and if they have to employ gig workers as normal employees, they will cease to be profitable. Their raison d'etre might even vanish. 2.1.4. Stakeholder capitalism at ESG. To be continued from page 185 of the chapter Micro Reset Industry and Business of the book COVID 19, The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab and Thierry Balleray, published by Forum Publishing in June 2020. Digital All Codes and Rules, No Copyrights is reading about educational premises only and Socratic debate is for future chats. To be continued, page